Hey friends, welcome to the Raising Boys and Girls podcast. I'm Sissy Goff.
And I'm David Thomas.
And I'm Melissa Trevathan.
And we're so glad you joined us for this conversation. Let's dive in. Dr. Robert Brooks is a psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and former director of the Department of Psychology at McLean Hospital. He has lectured nationally and internationally and written extensively about such topics as resilience across the lifespan, psychotherapy, parenting and family relationships, educational practices, and a positive school or work environment. He is the author or co-author of 19 books, including one of our favorites, Raising Resilient Children. Dr. Brooks has received countless awards for his work, including most recently the Mental Health Humanitarian Award from William James College for his contributions as a clinician, educator, and author. You will experience his passion and learn from his insights on what we can do as adults to build resilience into kids and adolescents. Dr. Brooks, you have given us permission to call you Bob, which we will work hard to do. We have tremendous respect for you, for the work you do. We have quoted your work in multiple books. We talk about your work in different speaking events, and it is just a joy and an honor to spend time with you today. And we'd love to even begin by having you tell us a little bit about you, your family, and how you found your way to the amazing work you're doing in the world.
Okay, I'll start with my family. My wife is Marilyn. We met in college, and we have two sons and four grandkids. We live outside the Boston area. Our youngest son lives a mile down the road, and our oldest son lives about a 2-hour drive in the Portland, Maine area. So we've really been very involved in our grandkids' lives as they were growing up. And I've just been very blessed, and I had two wonderful parents, and so family has meant a great deal to me. Switching to how I got interested in probably the work that has consumed my professional life in this topic of resilience, I grew up professionally when they had what was called the deficit model. You know, it's a model where you diagnose what's wrong with a client or patient and then, quotes, fix them. And I had several experiences along the way which really steered me towards a strength-based model. And just to share a few with you, after I got my doctorate and then I did additional training at the University of Colorado Medical School, and I got my doctorate at Clark University, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts, I came back to Boston, and for the next few years, I worked in the inner city of Boston, setting programs for challenging kids in the Boston schools. And little did I know it at the time, but the seeds of my interest in resilience were being planted because I started to wonder, why is it that some people who could grow up under racism and poverty, and yet you meet them as adults, they're much more hopeful and optimistic than you would have ever predicted? Probably the question wasn't even that well formed at that time. And then what really got me to think about resilience, both in children and in ourselves, I was invited to be the first principal of a school in a psychiatric hospital, McLean Hospital. McLean has been around since 1811.
Yes.
But for some reason, it took them many, many years, more than a century, to have services for children and adolescents. And the focus of the program was going to be on kids who were having major behavioral problems. And the head of the McLean called me and he said, "We've heard about your work in the inner city. We're going to need a principal here." And those were the days before managed care, where kids could be in the hospital anywhere from 2 months to a year and a half. Looking back, I may have been too young and too inexperienced, but the seeds were continuing to be planted. What happened is within, I'd say, just 2 months of the kids arriving. The first couple of months were wonderful, but that was before the children arrived. And I learned schools are very different without the kids being there, and especially in a locked door unit of a psychiatric hospital. So I'll just condense this. I totally burned out emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Mm-hmm. I had a headache and stomach ache every day. I was blaming the staff. They were blaming me. The kids were continuing to act up. And I had several aha moments. I was ready to resign. I came very close to resigning. But I said, if I resign today, for the rest of my life, I'm going to wonder, could I have taken this inpatient school in a psychiatric hospital where I didn't want to be, the kids didn't want to be, the staff didn't want to be, and at least changed it into something in which we all wanted to be. And I took several mental health days. And when I came back, I had also this epiphany, which is going to sound so simple to both of you. I said, these kids are not going to change unless I and my staff change. I mean, it sounds so simple now. And one of the things I smile about now, there was a child who one day approached me. He must have been 11. I don't know. He said, "You don't get it, do you, Brooks?" By the way, his words were a lot of, well, I'll keep this clean. I said, "Get what?" And he said, "We're going to outlast you." And my first thought was, you little, and I didn't say anything. And then coming home, and I didn't speak much about work with my wife, but I said, I don't think my techniques are working.
Mm.
So what happened, I had a much more courageous staff than I ever imagined. And what we realized is our forms of discipline were primarily punishment and arbitrary punishment. We weren't respectful of the kids. My mindset at that point was, these kids are out of control. They need someone to control them. Little did I know, years later, in a book I wrote about discipline, I was going to say some of the best disciplinary practices are housed in a positive relationship
Yes.
in that regard. So now, just to shorten it, we changed almost everything. I said we have to start looking at the strengths of these kids. We have to look at what we're doing. We have to more and more not expect them to change unless we change. So we changed our disciplinary techniques. We focus much more on shining the spotlight on their strengths, or what years later I was to call their islands of competence. And I still remember this moment, and then the story will end at that point, where about 4 or 5 months later, and I could smile about it now, we had a visitor who wanted, they were going to place hopefully some student teachers. And this visitor said to me, I can't believe this is a school in a psychiatric hospital. And I said, why? She said, the kids seem so respectful and responsible. Now, not all of them. And I whispered to one of the staff, do you think we're getting better kids? And of course, the staff member said, the kids are the same.
Mm.
We have changed. And so what seeds were being planted then were, so how does a child or an adult who's resilient, who's more hopeful, see the world differently from one who is not? Because the more I could specify that, the more I could say to parents, here are some of the ingredients, components of being resilient. And the more I could say to teachers the same thing, or even as a therapist, the same thing, the more I could then articulate or identify some of the components of resilience, they would guide me in my work. So I ended up working in McLean for 23 years, not all as director of the, of the school, but I always maintained close relationships with the school. And also because of my own sense of burnout and disillusion, and just feeling, am I helping anyone? You go into a field to help people and you feel the kids are getting worse. It got me to start doing a lot of thinking about, so how do you take care of yourself?
Mm.
So that you could take care of the kids. And, at the time, all of these things were happening. The reflection came a little later. But coming close to really resigning from a position and then really having that experience helped me to think about resilience was for me, it was a very good decision I made.
It was a good decision for all of us.
I was about to say,
we
it
benefited
changed a lot of
greatly
lives.
from your work.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
from-
Well, and bringing up McLean, so, you have had an extraordinary career caring for kids, caring for families, educating parents, training clinicians, including serving on the faculty at Harvard Medical School and as the director of the Department of Psychology. So as you said, not always in that role, you shifted some at McLean Hospital. And thinking back over all these years of caring for folks, how would you say kids have changed?
Yeah. one of the things I always tell people, because sometimes it's like it comes up and it's like 40 years ago, kids were fine. And working in a psychiatric hospital, look, we saw plenty of struggles that kids had. But I do think there are factors that have come up now that really play a large role and that kids have changed. And I've seen it in different ways. And the video I watched of you, Sissy, I think you used the word resources at one point in there.
Mm.
And I've often talked about coping strategies. And what I was feeling over the years is a couple of things. Is that first of all, kids do not have the resources, I feel, as they did, or coping strategies. There's not as much involved in really having time to sit down and help kids to be problem solvers. You know, a dear friend of mine was Myrna Shore, a psychologist who died a couple of years ago, and she spent her whole career on problem solving, teaching. And she wrote a book, Raising a Thinking Child, and then she wrote another book, Raising a Thinking Preteen, which someone told me was an oxymoron, but I do think, with all the hormones going there.
Right.
So I get concerned about, in terms of that kids do not seem to have, and I'll quote you again because I love the word resources, they don't have much of the coping strategies. And part of magnifying that, I've been looking more and more at the research in terms of screens. And there was just an article I posted on some of my social media sites of Michael Rich, a pediatrician at Harvard, looking at what happens to kids when, from an early age, 2 or 3 years, they look at screens and how it affects them emotionally and cognitively. So I feel some of the kids may not relate as well. Maybe they'll relate on the screens. And I know some of this has been magnified by certainly COVID and schools being closed. And the other thing is, and in no way am I criticizing parents, I think there's sometimes less time with parents than there should be. In my book, Raising Resilient Children, I said, when kids are young, but you could do it later, to have a special time. It could be 10, 15 minutes where you even say to the child, some families I've worked with, they say, when I'm with you, this is such a special time that even if the phone rings, I won't get it. And the reason I said that is I once saw a young girl in therapy, and she said, one week she came and said, I know my parents love me. And I said, how do you know they love you? And it was really sweet. She said, the phone rang and they didn't answer it. And that was
Wow.
cell phones. This goes,
Wow.
a number of years. And it's also harder to monitor some of the information kids are getting. Look, we know social media, which can be very positive, but for so many kids is really a negative experience. Because, certainly there's been research about girls and body image about that. And so many people on social media, it sounds like everyone has the perfect family and no one has any problems at all. We all know this. So one of the things, what I work on, in seeing kids in therapy or supervising therapists is really we have to help kids and adults develop coping strategies. We all use coping strategies. The problem is some are self-defeating.
Yes.
Other coping strategies can be very helpful. An example I just like to use, I remember when my kids were young, and we all love sports, and I coached them in basketball, but this was a Little League game, and there was a kid on my younger son's team. He struck out every time he was up, which just was 2 or 3 times at the most. But he goes over to the coach after the game. He said, I'm striking out a lot. Can you help me, with this? Another kid, same day, strikes out, screams at the umpire. It was just one of these poor fathers volunteering that day. You're blind, you're blind, you're blind.
Wow.
Arms off. Both were coping. But
Wow.
first kid had hope. He was more resilient. He thought you could deal with adversity by learning to problem solve with the coach. The other one, much to the embarrassment of the parents, screaming, you're blind to the umpire. His way of coping was not going to be very helpful. So one of the things I also look at is, okay, what do we do to help kids cope? Which gets to, what do we do to help parents cope? We all are coping. Every one of us use coping strategies. And if we look at our lives, some may have been more helpful than others. Like if I had quit that first position in McLean, that would not have been the greatest coping strategy. Rather to stick with it and not to use myself totally as a model, but to stick with it and try to figure out, okay, what can we do so that these kids feel more safe and secure in the school, in a psychiatric hospital. That was a much better mindset.
Thank you. And now a quick break to hear from one of our awesome sponsors so that we can bring you all this great content. Sissy, summer is here and you are headed to the lake this week.
I am going to live out on our porch at the lake house. It's one of my favorite places thanks to Wayfair. They are responsible for our porch furniture, rugs, and so much more. There's no better place to go for outdoor furniture than Wayfair.
Wayfair's huge selection of outdoor essentials will help you make your outdoor space more comfortable, functional, and most importantly, more you. We just outfitted our front porch too. New rugs, new cushions, new side tables. June loves the new rugs on the porch so much she sometimes won't come inside.
Get your outdoor space ready today so you can enjoy it all season long. The site is so easy to navigate, free and easy delivery even on the big stuff. No more huge delivery fees for patio furniture. Get big stuff like patio sets, gazebos, hot tubs, outdoor dining sets, and more shipped free.
There's something for every style and every home, no matter your space or budget.
Shop a huge selection of outdoor furniture online. This summer, get outside with Wayfair. Head to wayfair.com right now.
That's WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair, every style, every home.
David, what is your first thought when I say this word? Coffee.
Too much, too often. That's what my doctor said anyway.
Well, I may have a solution for you. I love my coffee routine, but I don't like the way it makes me feel. Everyday Dose has the classic coffee taste you love without the nasty side effects, plus added benefits. No crash and no jitters.
Everyday Dose is coffee plus benefits. It combines 100% Arabica coffee with powerful ingredients like lion's mane and chaga, collagen protein, and nootropics to fuel your brain, boost focus, and give you clean, sustained energy all day long.
No crash, no jitters, just clean, sustained energy. 2 products to highlight, Coffee Plus and Coffee Plus Bold. Coffee Plus is a mild roast, light and smooth. Low acidity, which is easy on sensitive stomachs. Mellow energy.
Coffee Plus Bold is a rich blend of medium roast, 100% Arabica coffee, robust and full-bodied yet smooth. Extra boost of energy.
Both are 100% Arabica coffee, have functional benefits, and are mold-free. Everyday Dose does third-party testing.
Get 45% off your first subscription order of 30 servings of Coffee Plus or Bold Plus. You'll also receive a starter kit with $100 in free gifts, including a rechargeable frother and gunmetal serving spoon by going to everydaydose.com/RBG or entering RBG at checkout. You'll also get free gifts throughout the year.
That's everydaydose.com/RBG for 45% off your first order.
And now back to the show. Well, and in thinking about how kids have changed over the years, to hear your thoughts there, we'd love to also ask, how have you seen parents change over the years?
Yeah. And again, a lot of it, we have to realize, well, not in my workshops, but my clinical practice, it's somewhat, I say that, skewed distribution in this way. These are parents having problems, but some of them, if they haven't been referred by, a doctor or a school, at least they're willing to start to confront these problems. I think parents, a lot of them, and again, I don't want to say everyone, but a lot of them, just like 30 years ago, 40 I used to hear about how many hours to let a child watch TV. Now, of course, it is screen time, which is more complicated because so many kids do their homework on screens. A lot of people that I worked with, parents, really feel sometimes that they don't know what is going on, more so than I saw a number of years ago. A lot of parents, I think, are very confused in terms of keeping in mind that discipline stems from the word disciple. It is a teaching process and a learning process. And so I've seen parents, in different extremes, some who are what we call, laissez-faire parents, and even more so that they don't want their kid to be upset at all. And I said, sometimes our kids are not going to like us at the moment, but I've never met a child who I feel wants to feel more powerful than the parent
Yes.
in their life. And then there are those parents, sometimes they had no models themselves. And I've seen it work both ways. I've seen parents who grow up in very harsh environments with very little love. Some of them become more the permissive ones. I don't want to grow up in an environment like that. But some of them, they're really model who their parent was. How often have I've heard this said, and sometimes it can be very positive, but often it's the negative, where they say something like, I swore I would never say this to my kid because I never liked it when, my father or mother said this to me. So I think there is more anxiety. We live in a very stress-filled world, and everyone is very, very busy, and the busyness, really it can play a role. Look, I was very fortunate, in our marriage and serving as parents. My wife was able to take time off, when the kids were little. And even her first job was with two psychology friends. She was excuse me, the office manager or whatever, 10 blocks from where we lived, their office was. So if there was an emergency, one of us could handle it. And especially my wife was 10 blocks away. And I know that is not true. Certainly, parents, today. So I do think there is more anxiety. COVID certainly added to it. But I also think the divisiveness in our own country and the anxiety in our own country plays a large role. And so there are many factors which I think are playing a role where parents get anxious, angry, and certainly that they're not going to be able to respond to their children in a very empathic way. And we'll talk about that.
Yes. Well, I just need to say here, if you are listening and you're not watching on YouTube, I think David and I are both going to have cricks in our neck later from how much we're nodding vigorously with
Yes.
everything that you're saying.
Yes, we are.
Just
Well,
so
of course,
agree.
that's why I keep talking, because I get positive feedback.
Well, so we love all of your books and all of your work. And we would say we could talk about all of them at length, but one of our particular favorites is Raising Resilient Children. And we would love to know something you would want parents today to know based on your research on resilience.
Okay. And interrupt me, because I could go on and on about that.
We love it. We're so grateful.
Well, thank you. When I started getting interested in resilience, and why some people handle adversity more effectively than others, there wasn't as much research, but there was some research that was already pointing me in a certain direction. Emmy Werner, who I think I probably consider the matriarch of resilience research, she was a Holocaust survivor. Most of her family was wiped out. And in the mid-50s, a number of people don't know her, but in the mid-50s, she goes to the island of Kauai in Hawaii and starts to study a population of very young children. And some of these kids were growing up in poverty. And every 10 years, it was a longitudinal study, she would write a book. One of my favorites was called Overcoming the Odds. And what I loved about Emmy Werner is she started to look at what factors, and she's studying these kids when they're toddlers, what factors lead them to be more resilient. And then there was Julius Siegel, a psychologist at Washington, D.C., Michael Rutter, psychiatrist in Great Britain. So they basically, and I don't want to overly simplify it, they basically asked people who were more resilient, who had dealt with adversity, the question, what do you think was one of the most important things in your childhood or adolescence to help you to be resilient today? I love those kind of questions. Get right to the source there. In almost every study, it didn't matter what country, the first answer was almost always the same. And some people might think it is simple. I think in a very spiritual way, it's why we're all here. The first answer, there was at least one person along the way who truly believed in me and stood by me. Even one person. And Julius Siegel, who I briefly mentioned, in a brief 3-page article that was to have a major impact on me in the 1980s, he wrote an article about resilience. His life was devoted to studying resilience. And he said in research conducted around the world about children of misfortune, that's almost any child who has problems, the ones who make it have during their childhood or adolescence the presence of what he called a charismatic adult. I almost wish he hadn't used the word charismatic because it has different meanings to different people.
Right.
But its definition is poetic to me. It's an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength.
Mm.
The reason I bring this up, I say to parents, we must never underestimate our influence. I say that to teachers. You know, when I hear from teachers, well, this kid comes from a terrible home, whatever, what can we do? I say, for some kids, the only moments of sanity, security, and love they'll ever experience will be in your classroom. And I say that to therapists. We are in a wonderful position, and both of you, do the same, that to have a lifelong impact in that way. Then what happened? So I started to talk about this charismatic adults. And then, of course, you get to the nitty gritty. Like people say, okay, I want to be a charismatic adult parent, or I want to be a charismatic teacher. What do I say or do? And this was a very exciting part of my career because I said, well, that's very important. I mean, what do you say? And that's when I started to think about back, what are the components of a resilient mindset? And with my colleague Sam Goldstein, when we were raising resilient children, we really started to look at what is that mindset and what are strategies that a charismatic adult, whether parent, teacher, coach, it could be almost anyone, therapist. That's when I started asking, okay, so what is a resilient mindset? What are the things that we should be looking at, experiences we can provide our child from a very early age so that they will more and more develop a resilient mindset? And why I found that a very exciting part of my career is it really got me to look at some of the research. This was pre-Google. It would have been easier with Google probably now finding the research and trying to specify or identify that mindset, because mindsets then lead to certain behaviors, and those behaviors then either reinforce or don't reinforce the mindset. So one thing is I started to say to parents and other adults, never underestimate the impact you could have. And I also added, because there's wonderful research, and I've been writing about this, sometimes you may come into someone's life, let's say a child's life, for an hour, but they will remember that hour for the rest of their lives. And so there are a few things I can mention. One is, and this may sound simple, but it's much more difficult. I started saying kids need unconditional love. We have to accept children for who they are and not where we want them to be. Now, I first heard that in graduate school before I became a parent. And I was so naive. I remember saying, well, what's so difficult about that? They're your kids. Of course you accept them. But then, you know what? Not every kid could be a superstar in academics or socially or whatever. And it's often much more challenging to accept a child for who they are. And especially I've worked with a lot of kids with special needs, that it's more challenging. It could become more critical. Kids were not born to be, like a testimony to our parenting, if you will. So accepting kids for who they are doesn't mean, by the way, parents have asked me this, you don't accept, behavior that is not, I'll use a word we used to use at the hospital, appropriate. But if a kid is not interested in sports, one asks, okay, what are their strengths? And again, I'll give you a quick story. I was seeing a couple, they had a 7-year-old boy, and a lovely couple. And the father, in the first session, I was meeting with the parents. The father said to me, I'll never forget this, he said, I feel I'm losing my son at 7. And I said, what do you mean? He said, one of the things that really kept my father and me close was love of sports. I remember him throwing a football, playing baseball. My son doesn't like sports. And so I said, what does he like? What are his islands of competence? So accepting kids, but also finding their strengths. And both he and his wife immediately said, at 7, you should see some of his drawings. He's a wonderful artist. And I said, well, when was the last time you saw your son happy? Which I also will like to ask, when he's drawing. And father said, it was a very poignant session, said to me, but I don't like artwork. I don't like to draw. And then I said to the father, because he had already told me he's losing his son, I said, look, at his age, I think you're going to have to accommodate more to his passions than he's going to accommodate to yours.
Mm.
Next day, father calls me. He said, I could not stop thinking about what you said. And he said, as a matter of fact, I just signed my son and me for an art class at one of the museums here in Boston. And the father called me after the first art class, if you will. He said, and it was very emotional. He said, to see my son so happy was like basically a blessing. And he said, my son even told me, because his father said he can't draw much at all. He even told me that maybe I'm holding my pencil wrong, or something. But yet, so he looked at his strengths. He accepted his kid for who he was. And so I say to parents, in terms of accepting kids, in terms of looking at their beauty or strengths, another thing, which has also I've just gotten more and more interested in, is a sense of purpose. And just to give you a little background about that, one of the first books I wrote was a book on school climate. I've been asked, almost like if you were creating a school, what would be the mindset of the teachers there? How, what training would you do? And I said, you know what? I'm going to do this. As I went around the country giving workshops, I gave people, and a lot of them were teachers, they were at educational conferences, I gave them a one-page questionnaire. I'll just go over the first question. The first question was, of all the memories you have of school, what is one of your best memories? And I wanted to see the impact of an adult. Something an adult at the school said or did that boosted, originally I said your self-worth, and I also added, and your dignity. One of the most common answers, which I had not expected, and now I'm wondering why I didn't, was when you were asked to help out. I got things like, I remember when a teacher asked me to pass out the milk and straws. I remember when a teacher had me tutor a younger child. And my first thought was, that's one of your best memories? And then I started thinking myself, and I remember in high school, when I was in 11th grade or maybe a senior, tutoring a 9th grader, and the feeling I got. So from that, I started more and more wondering, what happens if you're in an environment where you feel you're making a difference in the lives of others? And I was thinking a lot about both, at home and parenting, in terms of school and in terms of doing therapy. So what I would often say, especially when I went to schools, one of the first questions I would say to teachers I was consulting, say, about a kid who was a challenging kid in school, I would say, what is one thing this child does at school which makes him or her feel that they are making a positive difference in the lives of others? Because already research was coming out to show that kids were less likely to drop out of school, high school kids, if you invited them to go down to the elementary school and read just a couple hours a week.
Wow.
And so I started to say to parents, don't say to kids, remember to do your chores. None of us like chores. And I know words can be powerful. I said, ask them, say, I could really use your help. And this isn't just for kids. Whether you're 5 years old or you're 95 years old, when you feel there is a purpose in your life, when you feel you're helping, even volunteering an hour a week, it really extends your lifespan.
Yes.
And today we know loneliness is such a big issue. So often when you're helping others, you're often interacting in some way. And I tell parents, we so often say we want responsible, compassionate kids, but we don't give them opportunities. And through our places of worship or through whatever, do it as a family. Go for a walk for hunger as a family. Go for, and just a fourth thing, or I don't know if it's the fourth, fifth, but it has to do with mistakes. Basically, resilient people, and again, I don't want to overly simplify it, see mistakes as experiences from which to learn. Mm-hmm. But people who are not resilient see mistakes like that kid who struck out and ran off as another confirmation that they are not a very worthwhile person. And parents will often say, well, how do you help kids deal with mistakes? I say, well, first of all, you serve as a model. kids are exquisitely attentive to notice how you deal with mistakes. If you start to curse or blame others or whatever, they're not going to be you're not going to be a very good model. And so you model it. And then how you relate to your child is just very important. If they broke something, instead of saying, which I've heard a lot, I told you it wouldn't work. You never think. Instead saying, let's try to figure out this together. That gets to problem solving. So mistakes and problem solving are a key issue that I see as resilience. And now I'll pause.
That's so helpful.
Extraordinary. You also wrote a great book called Raising a Self-Disciplined Child, which we love. And every parent wants that. What are some practical ways that parents can help develop this in kids?
Yeah. And just to give a little background, one of the things I've done with parents is to say, well, there's research. Now there's so many different parenting styles, but I said, some of the first research came out in the 1960s by a psychologist, Diana Baumrind, who basically said there were three kinds, and then a fourth was added of parenting, which parents I found that I've worked with, I found helpful. So she said in her research, as parents, we have to think about what is our style, and sometimes they could overlap. And so once she called the authoritarian, and that's the parent who says you do it because I'm your parent. They often express very little love. They don't involve their child in problem solving. If the kid makes a mistake, they'll often scream and yell, and they are the boss. The outcome for kids in that household are not very good. Then they call permissive, which is, we talked a little about, the parent who may love their child, but is so afraid of not being loved back or so afraid of setting limits, and the child may be being angry for a little while. These kids could grow up very entitled in that. And what was added, and then I'll get to the one that goes with resilience. The fourth one that was added, which actually has in research the worst results for kids, is the neglectful or uninvolved. It's like my last website article, I talked about that, where one kid said to me in a single parent home, it could have been double parent, it didn't really matter, said, if I left today, I wonder if my mother would even know I was gone.
Mm-hmm.
Or that kind of feeling. So now to get to the one that most goes along with self-discipline, the authoritative. It sounds like authoritarian, but it's authoritative. And what that parent is, they're not afraid to set limits, but their limits set in a calm, reasonable way. They involve their child in problem solving in terms of basically, if the child has problems, let's try to figure out what we can do about these. They're actually teaching coping strategy. They demonstrate a fair bit of love and affection. And the child in that home, when parents set limits, it's not that the kid's going to say, oh, thank you so much for setting limits, but they feel much safer and more secure. And then I'll get into something I mentioned before. I always want to remind parents, what are the main functions of discipline? And, certainly we want a safe and secure environment, but I'll say another very important function is to develop self-discipline. And self-discipline means that even if you're not there, your child has started to take in or adopted rules and regulations for their own life and values for their own life. And then in any situation, which I've often said, look, if your kid is having a meltdown, the main thing is just, to calm the kid. Sometimes you have to even hold them. Those are not the times to start sitting down and problem solving. Those are the times to be most secure. I certainly found that with the kids at the hospital where I was principal, because most of them were there for really acting out behavior. They were very impulsive. They had their moods shifted constantly, and they just needed us sometimes to be there. And afterwards, we could talk about what might you do in the future. So in that book, I really try to capture some of the parenting styles to remind people that when kids develop self-discipline, in our book, we Raising Resilient Children, we say self-discipline is so involved with also problem solving, and it's really involved in all of our life's efforts, that we learn, we think about things in a certain way. We don't act before we think.
Yes. Well, I mean, again, we could talk about so many things that you've done. Let's jump to 7 steps to improve your child's social skills, which we have been talking a lot about social skills recently on the podcast. What would you say is something parents can do now, parents of kids of all ages, to improve their child's social skills?
Okay. First of all, might sound simple, but uh, people who have studied temperament in children, you really have to know your child. Chess and Thomas, who were husband and wife psychiatry team, they were some of the seminal writers about temperament. So the reason I bring this up, every kid, we know this is very different. Some kids are not going to be social butterflies. So the first thing, as simple as it might be, is really know your child, as was the name of the book. Because what happens is, Chess and Thomas in their book said that some kids are more easy to raise, and some come out, they slow to warm up or shy, and others are much more difficult temperamentally. So I would always ask parents to describe, when was the time you observed your child where you felt that their social skills were more effective, when it is not. And that's from there we could look at what can be done. Now, certainly there are things, before I lose this train of thought, in school, there are social groups in school, and that could be very helpful, because some kids normally might not have a relationship with other kids, but it could be very helpful to be with other kids. And not all kids who have social skills problems. I often like, more of it could be a mixed group. The other thing is, I've often said this, let's look at what our goals are. So sometimes parents say, I wish they even had one friend or someone, that they could communicate with. I don't know if it was in Raising Resilient Children, I said sometimes with some kids with social skills problems, especially if they're young, you have to do environmental engineering. You have to, in one sense, by the way, the way that term came up is when my sons went to overnight camp. After you're a camper and you want to become a counselor, the next tier up is environmental engineer, which basically was a fancy title, meant you clean up the place. But I like that.
Great.
So, if they have even one friend, so you invite the friend over. Yeah, you help your child in terms of things like some kids, they don't want to share their toys as much. So I've had parents say to the child, what toys don't you want to share? And we put those away. And so then the kid feels more comfortable sharing these things.
Right.
The important thing is for not to come across in a way, and kids could be very sensitive, where the child feels they're defective or not meeting their parents' expectations. And another thing is, in terms of kids who are more sensitive and have difficulty with social skills, you really have to think very much about the environmental engineering. Is my kid going into a situation which they can't handle? I remember one parent at one of my workshops said, I think her kid was 5 and he had some social skills problems already. And she said, it comes out even, I go into a supermarket and he has tantrums there. And one of the things I knew in doing the evaluation is this was a kid hypersensitive to sound. He was hypersensitive to touch. He goes in there, it would be like us going into a war zone. So the mother and father say to me, they say, yeah, but other kids his age don't have a problem with that. And that's, again, learning to know your child. I said, but that's your son right now. It may not always be that way. And so they say, well, what's the solution? And I said, right now, that environment, a large supermarket, is not going to work. So I said, is it possible if you have to go to the supermarket that you don't take him at that particular moment? I mean, it sounded so simple, but then we also worked out there was a small, convenience store, and that he didn't have as much problem.
Yes.
So they could see that. I mean, it sounds so simple when I say this, but here they were, well, other kids can do this, and, the social skills, related to social skills, there are certain environments one has to be very careful of bringing their kid into. They can be very hypersensitive. I remember with one of my grandkids when they were young, having a party, and one of the kids, when they were singing Happy Birthday, one of the kids ran into a closet holding his hands.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it was somewhat embarrassing to the parents, but, I said, well, right now, maybe he just has to leave the room. And I said, maybe he just needs you right now. And for me, it wasn't that loud. For most of the other kids, it wasn't that loud, but it really interfered with his being able to be in a situation, in terms of social skills. So I think we can, as kids are young, we could try to manage the situations.
Mm-hmm.
It's more tricky as they get older. This is where I feel kids spend a lot of time in school. I wish more and more teachers knew about neurodivergent kids.
Yes.
They're not doing these things on purpose. Some kids are very hyperactive. Some kids are not going to look you in the eye. And I think we've come a long ways in that regard, but I think we could come even much further along the way.
Yes.
I'm thinking as you were sharing that story, for a lot of years, I have quoted you from Raising Resilient Children, and I'm not going to do justice because I'm going to paraphrase right now.
Okay.
You have said, and you just gave a beautiful example of it, which is a really perfect way to think about ending this wonderful conversation. You talk about how, having a resilient mindset as a parent means if we're wanting our kids to be open to changing the script, then we have to be open to changing the script. And what a beautiful example when you talked about the supermarket story of that and why we have for so long admired and respected your work, and what rich wisdom you have offered to this conversation today, and how thankful we are that you were willing to say yes to this interview.
It's just a joy to meet you and learn from you.
Yes.
Well, you made me feel very good. So, because you're validating then, of course, some of the work I've done, and to hear it's been very helpful.
It certainly has. And will continue to be for all the folks who are listening.
Indeed.
Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
David, what a team we have that we get to call friends who help make this podcast possible.
Amanda Young, our operations manager.
Chris Starrett, our engineer.
Our management team at H Squared.
We are thrilled to be a part of the That Sounds Fun network.
Our music was created by the insanely talented Dave Haywood of Lady A.
And if this podcast felt helpful to you, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing, all the things.
We are grateful for you and cheering you on always.